So really a warm, heartfelt welcome to you all, to all of us who are here right now, and more people who are going to be joining this session through the recording or in subsequent meetings. And I want to begin with that same question I'm offering to all of you. Who are you? Where are you coming from? And why are you here? And why are we here? Why am I here? So this course is called Rifana, and it's an exploration of grief, trauma, and healing through a Jewish spiritual lens. And I'm not going to give exhaustive explanations or reasons, but in many ways, the material I'll be sharing in this course, these are teachings, gateways I might call them, practices that have been meaningful to me in an evolving way for years and throughout the years. I think specifically when it comes to our encounter with loss, with pain, with suffering. So to take an honest look at what we are experiencing and to also conceive of some kind of divine connection, some kind of possibility of even the idea of godliness or sacredness or holiness oftentimes gets very challenged. And I, for one, at least in my life, have never been able to swallow the sort of pat responses that we might encounter not only in our society around us, but specifically from religious contexts or lineages. Oh, don't worry, it's all for the good. Oh, well, at least XYZ, or just never did it for me. Maybe it has to do with my background. Maybe it has to do with my composition. Maybe it's just very human. And I see some nods. So some of you know of what I'm speaking. And what I'm hoping to share in this course are not answers to these deep areas of question, of destabilization, of wonderment or bewilderment, not answers, because I think that would diminish the truth of our experience and reality, but sources, teachings, and practices that to me can be in dialogue with the honest encounter with grief, loss, pain, trauma. So that's my hope. I'm going to spend a few minutes today giving a bit of an overview of the full 7 sessions of the course, and then we'll be spending the majority of today really looking at what to me is a kind of foundational framework or frameworks for conceiving of these experiences within a Jewish framework, within Jewish spiritual framework. I'll also say that today's session will be more survey in its nature, more kind of moving through various teachings or layers or facets, whereas in subsequent sessions, we'll spend more time focused in either a particular text or a particular theme or a particular story. So let me pull up just a moment. Sorry, pulled up the wrong screen, it seems. That's interesting. It's bringing up the wrong screen. So. Okay, this should work this time. Yes. Okay. Okay, so welcome. And I will ask that we all keep our mics muted throughout the session, other than the time when we're going to be more interacting. And hold on, I'm sorry, because I need to be bringing in more people through the waiting room. Excuse me just for this moment. Okay. So welcome. As I said, we'll begin with just a bit of a brief overview of the 7 sessions of the course, and then we'll dive into today's material. So today is going to be, as I said, a kind of survey and somewhat of a foundational framework. It's called In the Beginning, a Spiritual Lens on the Origins of Trauma. And I also want to say when I'm using the term trauma here today and throughout this course, unless I'm going to say something explicitly different, I'm not speaking about a clinical definition from a mental health or medical perspective. I'm not speaking about diagnoses here of complex trauma or PTSD, but I'm speaking about trauma as the human experience of encountering something that destabilizes the path of our life, that shakes, challenges, and uproots something in our emotional, physical, or mental or spiritual state that leaves a mark, such that the path that was before is altered. And that can be in very extreme and obvious, clear ways, that can be very subtle ways that we only are aware of in certain moments within the innards of our own experience. But it's really talking broadly about the experience of loss, of grief, of pain and suffering that we each carry, and that informs and shapes our life by its impact. The second session, which I called Facing the Unbearable, is going to be looking at a particular teaching from a particular teacher in our lineage who himself was a bereaved parent, and studying his teachings through the lens of his own personal experience and seeing what that offers as, again, a dialogue with life, God, and experience in the face of something that truly is unbearable. The third session, Sacred Silence and Sacred Protest, is going to be looking at the biblical story of Aaron, the high priest, and the loss of his sons in the temple, and Hasidic teachings throughout the generations on that experience. Again, the encounter with the divine, with the sacred in the face of something that is just so counter to all of what the promise of life at least causes us to hope for and expect. The next session, Living with Unanswerable Questions, speaks for itself, but we'll be looking at certain holidays, rituals, and points in the Jewish calendar that offer practices and gateways into grappling with experiences that not only we don't have the answer to, but perhaps don't have answers, and how we make space for that within our personal and spiritual lives. And I want to say that the 7 sessions of this course, in a sense, are going to be following a kind of arc of touching into some of these very intense experiences of loss, grief, and suffering, and slowly finding our way toward what we might call post-traumatic growth, post-traumatic learning, what we might call reconnecting with life in the face of such experiences. And so by the time we get to the fifth session, we're going to be looking at practices and teachings again that help connect us with the concept of rediscovering goodness, not by ignoring our pain, but through and after or in the face of our pain. The next session, Sweetening the Bitter Waters, Post-Traumatic Learning, is going to be looking at a specific story from the Torah, from the Bible, that with a lens to an experience of, in a sense, a traumatic re-triggering and a process of moving through and past it into something new. And finally, Cultivating a Heart of Compassion is going to be focusing on, I'm hesitant to say gifts, but the possibilities, the heart possibilities that remain for us, having gone through some of these experiences of challenging loss and pain. And I want to also just say a few kind of big picture things before we dive in, which is that I do not come to this as an expert, as an authority. I come to this as a fellow traveler, as a fellow human. I'm sure that there are many of us here in this room who know trauma, grief, and loss up close in ways much more deeply than I do. And my hope is that I'm sharing some of the teachings and practices that have at least made sense for me to be in dialogue with in my experience of being human, in the hope that they may find dialogue with your own experience, and maybe some of that dialogue will be opposition. There's no need for us to swallow the teachings that have been passed down to us or that I chose to share. Some of them might evoke strong responses from us, and I really truly welcome that. I'm here in a shared exploration and search with all of you, and really hope that in this process we'll have space to, whether in our sessions toward the end where there's space for reflection, or in the WhatsApp group as we go through the 7 weeks of this course, to really have space to be able to digest and share and chew over what these teachings touch within each one of us, and really be learning together and from one another. And I'll say one more thing about today and the subsequent sessions, which is that my feeling about much of, at least the Jewish textual tradition, is that part of our very rich intellectual tradition and lineage is itself a byproduct of trauma, in the sense that throughout the generations, when being in a Jewish body was oftentimes not safe or secure or nourishing, we really had a true spiritual refuge and place of resilience and creativity and vitality in the area of the mind, in thought, in conception, in teaching, and in learning. And I'm hoping that we will not get lost through this course in conceptualization that is disembodied. My hope is to be bridging text with practice, and I'll even admit that the way we're going to do it is perhaps less than would be ideal, because we'll be moving through text and then giving space for practice, and that is more than not having, but it deserves to be integrated even more than we'll probably have the space to do session by session. Okay, so let's move into today's exploration. In the beginning there was. And here we're going to be moving through a number of different takes on what there was in the beginning. And for many of you, you hear these words in the beginning, and I just want to invite you to drop in the chat here. In the beginning, what comes next? How does that sentence get finished? What are the next words that come to mind in the beginning? Feel free to. In the beginning, there was a separation. Okay. Thank you, Betty. Just free association. What comes next? There was expansiveness. There was light. There was tohu vavohu, light, chaos. Okay. God created the heavens and the earth. So really the opening lines and words of the Torah, Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim v'et haaretz, oftentimes translated as in the beginning, God created heaven and earth, although in a lot of renderings, in the beginning of God's creation of heaven and earth. And here we'll be looking at a number of different takes on what is in the beginning or what was in the beginning. And before we move into traditional Jewish teachings, I'm going to be reading a piece here that's going to be in a source sheet I share with you afterwards from a book called The Smell of Rain on Dust, Grief and Praise by Martin Prechtel. And here, I just want to invite you to listen. The author is writing here about the loss that each one of us experiences with our very entry into the world. That the space we are in the womb, is itself so suffused with comfort, support, and safety that there is inevitable loss in these very beginning moments. And here's what he has to say. The loss of our mother's heartbeat and the loss of the hungerless life in the womb are so traumatic and gigantic an event in every child's immediate beginnings as to cause all of us as newborns to utilize the very first inhalation of our tiny little lungs to cry out in grief. While the very first breath we take burns our still unhardened tender chest of lungs, still we instinctually know from this very onset of our life as an air-breathing human creature that we must sing out our grief in a glorious musicality with that first exhale. Our very lives start out from the very beginning by us crying out as hard as we can in a newly found voice. Not in a complaining squeal of rage for not having things stay the same, but in a sorrowful musical wail, tiny and beautiful, that says, Mama, where are you? Where am I? I'm cold and alone here without your drumming heart. It's a grief poem, a song. As humans, we start our lives from the very first instant with a deep artistic expression of our first loss. Not with a phlegmatic smile, nor with a void, empty slate, but with a truly elegant, active spiritual intelligence that knows we must sing grief a song, whose grandeur, even for its smallness, has all adults in hearing distance tearing up as well, because all real grief causes all to grieve. All of us were born masters of that hopeful, life-giving sound of grief the day we rolled in. The sound that all humans somewhere know instinctually for grief. It is a newborn baby's grief wail that is the most profound form of praise for being alive. Everyone knows this. We should have all gotten only better at it and even more beautiful throughout our lives and throughout history. But culture would not condone it. It doesn't need to stay lost. Babies know what we all know inside. The grief for the loss of the rhythm of the mother, who is the earth, and for whom we should all again find a voice and mind to elaborate that grief into praise. And so this eloquent ode to the grief song that we each sing upon arriving in this world is an invitation to allow ourselves to touch that very familiar, essential, fundamental knowing of what he calls the grief song, the song of life that that grief is. And here to allow us to also explore through the Jewish lineage teachings about what really is, and a space to be able to face that and to find the life that may be in there. So one take of what is in the beginning, what was in the beginning. In the beginning, there was chaos, as some of you wrote in the chat. And here we turn to the second verse of the Torah. I'll say in the Hebrew, "V'ha'aret hayta tohu vavohu." The earth was chaos and desolation. V'choshech al pnei tohom, there was darkness upon the face of the deep. V'ruach Elohim merachefet al pnei hamayim, and the divine spirit hovered upon the face of the waters. This is the snapshot of the beginnings of creation and of our universe. And I translated tohu vavohu not as chaotic and desolate, but as chaos and desolation, because they really are nouns much more than they're adjectives. And this tohu vavohu, this, we'll see other expressions of it, emptiness, disorderedness, formlessness. The Torah is telling us is the very foundation of our universe and of existence as we know it. It becomes then not merely some sinister, destructive, or outside energy or force, but is actually root material at the foundation of creation. And here we'll look at a rabbinic teaching from the Midrash. The rabbis say that in the way of the world, if a king of flesh and blood would build a palace on top of sewage, trash, and a foul stench, and someone were to come along and say, this palace is built on top of sewage, trash, and a foul stench, would it not be offensive? In a similar vein, if someone were to come along and say that this universe was created from chaos and emptiness, would it not be offensive? It would be shocking. Rav Huna said in the name of Bar Kapara, if it were not written in the Torah, it would be impossible to utter these words. In the beginning, God created. From where did creation emerge? The very next words, the earth was chaos and emptiness. So the rabbis here are acknowledging the shocking nature of these opening words of Torah. It's inappropriate. It's offensive. You would never say this about God's world, built on a pile of sewage and trash, of nothingness, of wreckage. And yet, the Torah starts there. Here we have the commentary of Rabbi Shlomi Yitzchaki, known as Rashi, who explains Tohu Vavohu in slightly different terms. He says that the word Tohu is not merely about chaos. It's not a chaos out there. The word Tohu relates to astonishment and confoundedness. For a person is astonished and confounded by the emptiness it contains. In the Hebrew, it's a little clearer. Sha'adam toheh umishtomem al bohu sheba. He's explaining what does it mean the earth is tohu vavohu. Creation is tohu vavohu. It is a shocking experience to encounter the bohu that was there. So we'll get to bohu in a minute, or vohu. But the word tohu, he says in Hebrew, comes from toheh, astonishment, bewilderment. Tohu is not merely a description of what the world was like. It's a description of what our experience is when we encounter this, in a sense, substrate level of creation. And he goes on to explain bohu, that it means rekut v'tzadu, emptiness, desolation. Again, it's a kind of encounter with something that evokes a sense of shock within us. So if we're to reread the Torah in Rashi's language, in the beginning God created, the beginning of God's creation of heaven and earth, the earth was shockingly desolate. was shocking and empty, was shockingly formless. And what I love about this teaching is that it brings us, in a sense, right to what it seems like the rabbis in the previous midrash were also saying, is that tohu vavohu, the Torah's description is there to wake us up to the shocking reality of life in this universe and of the beginnings of creation and the beginnings that, as will continue to expand, do not necessarily belong all the way back there at the very ancient beginnings of time, but are beginnings in the sense of the substrate of what continuously is. Moving on to the next take. In the beginning, there was pain. This comes from the teaching of the Baal Shem Tov, the originator of what became the Hasidic movement. And the Baal Shem Tov is working with the next verse. And God said, let there be light, and there was light. Right? Somebody wrote in the chat earlier, in the beginning, God created light, or there was light. But in the Hebrew, Vayomer Elohim Yehi Or, Vayehi Or, and there was light. So in the name of the Baal Shem Tov teaches a Talmudic teaching that the rabbis say that whenever the Torah uses the word Vayehi, as it does here, Vayehi, and there was, that it always implies pain or suffering. Whenever the Torah is telling a story or opens an episode by saying Vayehi and it was, it implies a painful moment. And the Baal Shem Tov explains, what does it mean then when the divine says, let there be light, Vayehi, light, and there was light? And by the way, that word Vayehi, it in the rabbinic rendering, it has to Vay, it's like Ve, Oy, Ve, Vayehi, Ve. It's an expression, it's a groan telling us about what happened. It's a sigh of pain. So Vayehi Or, and there was light. This means that the infinite one wanted to enclose itself so that creation could receive its goodness and light. But to do that, it necessitated Vayehi. It necessitated a contraction, Kabbalistically known as tzimtzum. The divine moving, contracting itself in a painful way, the Baal Shem Tov is lifting up here, from that expansive, endless, infinite light, being, beyondness, to something that is contained enough to sustain life, to sustain creation. And so even in that very first movement, that very first motion from infinite to finitude, from divine being to creation, there's an expression, an experience, a divine experience, even the Baal Shem Tov is saying, of Vayehi, of Oy, God hurting, God suffering, God's pain in creating a universe and light that is in its limited form as we know it. Moving on, in the beginning, there was destruction. The Midrash says, in the name of Rabbi Yehuda Bar Simon, in the story of creation, it says, Vayehi erev vayehi voker, and it was evening, and it was morning. And he notices, it doesn't say it was evening, rather, and it was evening. And he says that this addition of the word and, it implies that there was time existing before this point of what, if you just read the narrative of the Torah, the first day of creation, it was evening and it was morning. But no, and it was evening, he says, it implies a continuity with something that preceded it. So what is it that preceded the story of creation as we know it? Rabbi Abahu teaches that God was creating worlds and destroying them. Melamed shahaya bore olamot umachrivan. Until God created this world and said, these ones, this universe, this is pleasing to me. Those other ones, what I created beforehand, was not pleasing to me. And while this seems like a kind of mythic description, and it is all this, everything that we're looking at here is in the realm of spiritual myth. In a sense, it echoes some of what we may also be aware of billions of light years of existence preceding the formation of a galaxy and planets that can sustain life as we know it. That in a sense, our universe has a whole much longer backstory of creating worlds and destroying them, so to speak, of universes that precede life as we know it. As the Midrash says, there was time preceding this point, but we don't really have story to it. Because as far as we can relate to, it's non-life. It is destruction. And this Midrash becomes a very foundational teaching in the Kabbalistic worldview of what some of you may be familiar with of Shvirat HaKelim, or the breaking, shattering of the vessels. This next slide here, when I read this Midrash, the best picture I could come up with was some of what the Webb telescope shows us about truly ancient time, that has this kind of, I don't know if I would call it destructive view to it, but a sort of something both beautiful and almost overwhelmingly fierce and monstrous, if you will. And I took this piece from Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan's Meditation in Kabbalah because the truth is, in the Kabbalistic texts, to bring a text that would explain the breaking of the vessels in a way that would just be straightforward is quite hard, because it's actually quite complex in the original teachings. But he does a good job of summarizing here. He says the first stage of creation is called the universe of chaos. Brings us back to, in the beginning, there being tohu. And the Kabbalists see tohu as really stage one. And again, not only stage one chronologically, but the emergent point behind all that is. And this is a state where the vessels, which were the primitive 10 sfirot, could receive God's light, but could neither give nor interact. I think there's a typo there. So these vessels that I'm not going to go into, some of you might be familiar, some not, but this concept in the Kabbalistic teaching that there are vessels that carry the primary energies of creation, the primary divine energies of creation, known as the 10 Sfirot. And that in this world of Tohu, in this preceding universe of chaos, the vessels were there, like all the divine energy was there, but they could not give to one another or interact. There wasn't relationship between them that allowed for life to be generated. And he goes on, insofar as they did not resemble God, these vessels were incomplete, right? They were, in a sense, too siloed. And therefore, they could not hold the divine light that was being channeled through them to form the world. And since they could not fulfill their purpose, they were overwhelmed by the light and shattered. This is the idea of the breaking of the vessels. And this is basically a backstory, but the Kabbalistic worldview, which posits that our universe is, in a sense, formed of broken shards of divine light, broken shards of divinely formed vessels created to hold, communicate, and share the divine light of creation. And so in the beginning, there was destruction. Our world is built on wreckage. I have an image of like a junkyard, but not in a demeaning way, but in a sense that the fullness of the divine energy and purposefulness and being in presence and relationship that the world is offered for is in a shattered, broken, and dispersed state. And without dwelling on this too much, the Kabbalistic vision of the purpose of life on this planet is to bring tikkun, repair and healing. to this very broken, world and all of the elements therein, and reviving the presence of divine energy that is here. And to bring this analogy one step further, the teachings that in the beginning there was death, not only chaos, pain, destruction, but actually death in Kabbalistic teachings. And here, this teaching is brought from Rabbi Avraham Yitzchak Cohen Kook, mystic of the modern period. And he says, all existence is revealed through a process of descent from godliness to worldliness. In the Hebrew, me'elohiyut le'olamiyut, from divinity to worldliness, which is a form of degradation and a terrible death. And here he's not inventing this language. This is actually found in the medieval Kabbalistic teachings of the Arizal, Rabbi Chaim Vital, that speak of any descent, spiritual descent. And descent here, again, it's a word that's used by way of analogy. It's not from high to low, but it's from origin, from source to manifestation. Any movement from a level of greater divinity to less revealed divinity is referred to as a death. And Rav Kook goes on, he says, all descents of this world from one level to the next, from greater degrees of capability and capacity to lower degrees of capability and capacity will never equal. In a sense, the death that the divine experienced or goes through in order to create this world, to birth this world, is unmatched by any other form of degradation or death that we will know of in terms of its scale, in terms of its degree. And he goes on, he says, however, the foundation of ascending is hidden within this descent, right? Lest you think that he's saying that the world is therefore a death sentence or purposeless. He says, no, the foundation of ascending is hidden within this descent. And it precedes the order of time, meaning before this world is set into motion, this death, so to speak, this divine death is fueled by, preceded by a greater vision of what he's calling ascent or return or reconnection. For the ascent is already contained within it, and the deepest depths of discernment and the mighty mountains of righteousness will kiss. And here Rav Kook, in his, as he does, writes in deep spiritual poetry. And part of what he's touching on here is the mishpat and staka, this discernment and righteousness, really pointing to, in a sense, the mystery of the divine purposefulness or way of creation that he says is fueled by discernment and righteousness, as much as it's this great experience of loss of godliness for the sake of worldliness, of death and suffering that exists within this long span of time. He says that it is ultimately moved by divine discernment and righteousness, because it is moving toward, and this is from the greater paragraph that this was called from, moving toward an ultimate purpose of our own connection and coming into fullness and wholeness with the divine, as the separate individual beings we are, as the collective beings we are. That is only possible through this severing, through this death of God, so to speak, for there to be a world that is separate in its own experience. And we looked here now at a number of these just views of what kind of destabilizing, traumatic underpinnings there are to reality. And yet, as I said earlier, those are not seen as accidents of creation or as things that need to be sort of cast away or avoided, but they're actually the foundation upon which our world exists. So we see from the book of Job this description of God stretching out the north, al tohu, upon emptiness, upon chaos, upon formlessness. Tole eretz al blima, the earth hangs upon blima, which means no thing. So I read these words and I imagine, our earth hanging here in space, in this galaxy upon the endless galaxies. What is holding us here? And I imagine from the book of Job, not just a kind of NASA snapshot of the picture of the globe, but a true acknowledgement that as far as we can grasp, existence is hanging on a thread of nothingness. And yet Job attributes this to the divine way of things. This is how God is with our world. This is how our world is with God. It is being suspended upon no thing. And I want to come back into Genesis chapter 1, and offer a slightly new way to read those words, which I believe is faithful to the text. As we saw, the earth was chaos and desolation, tohu vavohu. There was darkness upon the face of the deep, and the divine spirit hovered on the face of the waters. The next words of that verse, Vayomer Elohim yihi or. God said, often translated as, let there be light. Vayihi or, and there was light. But I believe that in light of the teachings that we just saw, we can see these words yihi or slightly differently. Not so much let there be light, as if it was something, imported from outside of this vision of tohu vavohu, choshech, chaos, desolation, darkness, the deeps, the divine spirit. But I imagine God speaking to, communicating to, interacting with this admixture of chaos and desolation, darkness, deep waters, and the divine spirit, and saying to all that was in there, be light, yehi or, in a sense, commanding, urging all of that chaos, that tohu vavohu, that darkness, the water, to itself formulate into light. Vayehi or, and it became light. In the Kabbalistic teachings, the universe of tohu, the element of tohu, of chaos, is not something that happened in time and ended for there then to be a world of tikkun, of repair, of things being right in their proper order. No. Underneath our orderly existence is constantly the deep waters of chaos, of emptiness. And not only underneath, but even within all that exists. The chaos, the unformed, the mysterious is that dynamic engine of creative energy that lives within what is given shape and form. So we are never detached from the chaos. We are never separate from those depths, the ultimate unknown. We can be more or less conscious of it. We can experience life with greater sense of, I was going to use the word safety from it, but I don't even think that it is necessarily unsafe. But we can experience life in such a way that we are not forced to encounter and acknowledge it. And yet we tend to have these moments where, oh, it's right here. It's just here, just right on the other side. And so then the question becomes how we relate to the tohu vavohu that exists here within our lives and among us. Do we have space to welcome it? Is there room for us to live alongside it? That becomes the great challenge that we face, especially in encounters that are destabilizing, encounters where the chaos gets thrown at us. I'm just going to take a moment and check the chat because I've not been able to see it through this. Very beautiful. Thank you for this. And yeah, I'll come back to some of these later. And here is again another teaching on the tohu and bohu, the tohu vavohu, that is not only something in the past, but something that persists, something that we are called to relate to. This is from the Bahir, which is also a Kabbalistic, a foundational Kabbalistic text. There's a lot of debate as to when it was actually authored and by whom. But here Rabbi Brechia said, what's the meaning of the verse, Ha'aretz hayta tohu vavohu? The earth was chaos and desolation. What's implied by the word was? The earth was chaos. This indicates that the chaos existed previously. Meaning again, the chaos, the tohu, is ancient. It's pre everything. And then he goes on, what is chaos? What is tohu? It's something that confounds people, similar to what we saw in Rashi, right? Something that causes us to be bewildered. And what is bohu? Desolation. It's something that has substance, as in bohu, bohu. And I'll just show you the wordplay he's doing in the Hebrew. But if you remember, bohu, desolation, emptiness. Here, Rabbi Brechia, the Sefer Bahir, is actually saying, no, that emptiness, actually, there is substance to it. It may appear empty. We may experience it as empty. But bohu, in the Hebrew, bohu, those three letters, bet, hey, vav, can be broken into bohu, which translates as it or he is within it. Bohu means there's something inside there. There's something there. So I believe on the surface level, the Bahir is saying the bohu, that energy or absence even in this world that we cannot identify anything being there, it's a substance of another kind. It is what we'd say in Hebrew, a mamashut, a realness that is there that we experience as being empty or absent, but it is not in its essence empty. And I believe the Bahir is also trying to communicate bohu to say the divine is within that emptiness. The divine is within that desolation too. It might not be detectable, but bohu, it is within it. It is there. And here I want to move now into teachings that may be a bit more challenging even, and are so challenging that our tradition grapples with them. These are verses from the book of Isaiah. I am God, I am the divine, there is none else. I form light and create darkness. Yotzer or uvore choshech. I make peace and create evil. Oseh shalom uvore ra. Ani Adonai osechol ele. I, God, do all of these things. And for those of you who are familiar with the traditional Hebrew liturgy, these words, Yotzer or uvore choshech, forms light and creates darkness, appear in the daily blessing before the Shema, the Kriyat Shema, that statement of God's oneness, Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad, the statement of the oneness of all, the divine oneness that is a daily kind of the primary call of the Jewish people. So in the blessing that precedes those words every morning, that prayer every morning, the blessing is Yotzer or v'rechoshech, God forms light and creates darkness. Oseh shalom, makes peace. Uvore, and in the rendering of the liturgy, uvore et hakol, and creates everything. The rabbis actually changed the wording of the original verse to adapt it into our liturgy. And the Talmud has a debate. What are we doing changing the words around here? And the rabbis end up saying, God creates everything. Instead of saying God creates evil, it's a euphemism. We're using the term hakol, all of it, creates all, euphemistically in place of creates evil. And I think there are a number of things going on there. Number one, perhaps it's too challenging to ask people to say these words every morning and to then proclaim God's oneness. But at the very same time, the rabbis made sure that we are referring to these words every day. That in order for us to claim and proclaim God's oneness and the unity of existence and of the divine, we need to actually say to ourselves, you know what? God is one in all, in light and darkness, in peace and evil. That ultimately to proclaim a faith in a unified divine reality, it has to somehow include even the things that when we look at them and when we experience them, we do not experience God. And in a way, I believe the rabbis also offered us a way that we can do that more accessibly by saying Uvrei et hakol. And there we can take stock of all of it. And all of it includes Ra. All of it includes evil. But rather than harping on that word. And that word of all that God makes, that God has made, it comes up early on in the Genesis story as well. At the end of the 6 days, the first 6 days of creation, it says, Vayar Elohim et kol asher asa. God looked at all that God had made, v'hinei tov ma'od, and it was very good. And the rabbis in the Midrash say it's the first time throughout the 6 days of creation, and at the end of each day, well, almost at the end of each day, but a refrain throughout creation is v'hinei tov. And God sees it was tov, that it was good, that God deems creation good. It's only here at the end when it says God sees all that God made, that it's tov ma'od, that it's very good. The rabbis talk about what is this ma'od, what is this veryness, what is more than good that God is referring to here. And before we get to the midrash I brought here, some of the other midrashic statements are hine tov ma'od, it has to be something more than good, it has to be something beyond good, it has to be something that isn't good. The rabbis say, Hine tov ma'od, it is the angel of death. Hine tov ma'od, it is the impulse for evil. The rabbis recognize that to say there's something more than good in creation is that it's making space for something that we may not refer to or experience as goodness in this world. And here a very evocative teaching that the rabbis say in the Torah of Rebbe Meir, one of the great sages of the Talmud, Rebbe Meir, they found it written, V'hinei tov ma'od, it was very good, that it was written differently in his Torah. In his Torah scroll, it said, V'hinei tov bot, and behold, death is good. Now, not to get into what it even means that Rebbe Meir had a Torah that was written differently than everybody else's Torah, there's actually another example of something the rabbis teach was written differently in his Torah. Rebbe Meir, by the way, the name Meir means to illuminate. And in a sense, Rebbe Meir is a figure who holds a kind of perspective on the dichotomies of Torah and of life that really throw any sense of dualism on its head. And I'm not going to go into the other examples, but he's a figure who in a sense, his teaching and his perspective encompasses good and more than good. And so here they find his Torah actually says at the end of the 6th day of creation, God saw all that God had made, and v'hinei, even death is good in that vast vision that includes all of creation. And so here for the last sources we're going to look at today is moving into a Talmudic teaching that also relates to some of the very early stages of the story of creation. And that in my mind, this is just me personally, my feeling is that this story in the Talmud is essential Jewish theology. And without this story, I feel that we're just missing so much. And we'll see how it speaks very directly to our own struggles and grappling with the absence of good in our world. This is from the Babylonian Talmud from Tractate Chulin. So Rabbi Shimon ben Pazi, he notices a contradiction in the verses of the Torah. He says that this is the third day of creation in Genesis, that the verse says, Vayas Elohim et shnei hame'orot hagedolim. God made the two great lights. The two great lights being the sun and the moon, obviously. But then in the very next words, it says, Et ha'ma'or hagadol lememshelat hayom, the great light, the big light to rule by day, ve'et ha'ma'or hakaton lememshelat halayla, and the small light to rule by night. So Rabbi Shimon was like, what does it mean? The Torah says in one verse, God created the two big lights, the big one and the little one. What are we missing here? So as the Midrash tends to do, fills in the gaps. And he says that there were these two great lights in the beginning of creation, the moon and the sun of equal size and illumination, of equal light. And the moon said before the Holy Blessed One, the moon said to God, Master of the universe, is it possible for two kings to share one crown? In a sense, are we both going to be able to be the big lights? How is that going to work? So God replies to the moon, go and make yourself small. The moon turns to God, and I use the word she because in the Hebrew is a gendered language, and in the Torah and in the Talmud, the moon here in this dialogue is referred to in the feminine. And while that's both a linguistic piece of livana, the Hebrew word, Kabbalistically, the moon is what's regarded as the feminine principle in creation. So I'm keeping that gendered language here. So she says in response, God says to the moon, go make yourself small. And she says, Master of the universe, because I made an accurate claim, I should diminish myself, right? The moon asked a good question. God, you made two great lights here. How are we going to share this? How are we going to coexist of equal light? And God says, make me small. So the moon says, hey, what's up with that? I asked you a good question. That's your response. So now we see God attempts to appease her. God says, okay, go and rule by day and by night. So God says to the moon, shine your light. You don't have to just shine your light in the day and the night. You'll be the small light. Don't worry, you can hang out during the daytime too. The moon says, what benefit is there to a candle in broad daylight? In other words, the sun is shining throughout the day. My light isn't going to add anything. My light isn't going to even be noticed. A candle in daylight disappears in the face of the light of the day. So God says, okay, you know what? Go and let Israel count the days and the years by you. And by the way, every time God responds in the Hebrew, it says lechi, which means go. It almost sounds like God is depicted here as trying to get the moon to leave me alone. Go. Like let go of it and just go do the thing I'm asking you to do, be the small light. So God says, go and Israel will count the days and the years by you. Meaning, as we know, that the Hebrew calendar is a lunar calendar, but the moon replies, counting days, the days of the year, would be impossible because it wouldn't account for the seasons. As it says, they shall be signs for seasons, they shall be for signs and seasons, for days and for years. So without getting into the details here, the moon basically says, okay, but we need to keep the seasons in a regularly recurring order. And for that, the moon isn't going to help us. We need to be able to count by the sun as well. So God says, okay, so go and don't worry, Tzaddikim will be named after you. You're the small light. You know, Yaakov, Jacob, he's called the small one. He's, Rivka's Bnah HaKatan, her younger son. Shmuel, right? The prophet Samuel, he's also known as small. right? He began prophecy as a child. David, King David, the king of Israel, he's also going to be called small because he's the youngest son of his father Yishai. And she wasn't having it. The Holy One saw that the moon would not be appeased. None of these responses quite cut it. So God says, okay, I'm going to stop trying to convince you to accept or to be appeased. Bring an atonement for me for making the moon small. God says, in a sense, I need to be atoned for. I'm the cause of wrongdoing here. And I'm in the wrong and I need atonement. So please bring an atonement for me for making the moon small. And this is, as Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish said, just for some background, in the text of the Torah and throughout the centuries in ancient times, there was temple service and there was sacrificial service as part of the primary act of devotion, the primary act of religious ritual was bringing sacrifices, animal sacrifices. And in the animal sacrifice of Rosh Chodesh, of the new moon, okay, which by the way, how much is the moon shining on Rosh Chodesh? How small is the moon on Rosh Chodesh? The new moon is actually the time of the month where there is no light of the moon. The moon is so small that it disappears. And when it comes to the sacrifices that are commanded to be brought in the Mishkan, in the sanctuary, or in the temple on Rosh Chodesh, on the new moon, it says to bring Seir Izim Echad L'chatat L'Adonai. It says to bring one goat offering, L'chatat, as a sin offering, LaHashem, for God. That word LaHashem can be translated as to God. Bring a sin offering of one goat, LaHashem, to God. That would be perhaps a conventional way to read it. But Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish reads it. He says, no, this is saying bring a goat offering, a sin offering of one goat on God's behalf. The Holy One said, this goat shall be an atonement for me because I diminished the moon. That when it comes to Rosh Chodesh, to the new moon, to the time when the small light of this world, the feminine principle, the moon, is so small that it seems to cease to exist, it seems to disappear. In a strange and surprising reversal, a kind of radical reversal, God is asking us for forgiveness. God is saying, I am the source of the lack of light. I am the source of the diminishment. And I have no way to appease you. I have no way to make up for what I did other than to ask, to request, to beg that you atone on my behalf. What that might mean, what that might look like, I'm not going to try to answer right now. But to bring it in this context of all that we've looked at so far, of there being, again, in the earliest stages of creation, the underpinnings of our being here and existence and experience in the world, chaos, pain, destruction, death, inescapable elements of life in this world that the universe can't exist without. The tohu that is the ground of existence. It's not all of existence, but it accompanies all. And the Talmud here, in a sense, depicting a radically different way of relating to that contraction, to that lack, to that absence. Saying, there's the absence is not something that definitionally needs to sever our relationship with God, but is something that can offer a radically different relationship with the divine than we may have imagined. One that, in this story, in this depiction, truly honors our experience of pain. God saying at the end of the day, you're right. You're right. I've done this to you, and I'm sorry. Now, the part that I'm not going to try to resolve, and 2 sessions from now, we're actually going to do a deeper dive in Hasidic readings on this story that really do a deeper treatment with it. But what in the world does it mean, God asking us to atone for God? God bucking responsibility? Okay, yeah, I made the world full of absence, full of darkness. I made you contract into smallness. But can you just atone for me? Like, how does that make any sense? And how do we navigate that? We're not going to answer that. These are some of the questions it brings up. But where it leaves us is in possibility of a different kind of relationship with the Creator, where it's not just God doing to us, but God also asking us to, in a sense, step into a role of providing something that is lacking here. Right? For God to say, bring atonement for me, is on its very basic level saying that the absence in this world, the pain and the suffering in this world, leaves room for us to, in a sense, step into the space where God is not. What that looks like, do we want to do that? Is that how it should be? I don't have answers to that, but I'm just laying out the template right now. The last thing I want to bring is, these verses that this Gemara, this Talmud is working with, are God creating the sun, the moon, and then the end of that verse, Ve'et kochavim, and the stars as well. And I just want to end by bringing one last teaching on the creation of the stars. After the big light of the sun, the little light of the moon, it says, and the stars. And Rashi, commentary of Rashi says, big light, little light, and the stars. Because God diminished the moon, God gave her many stars, the Hafiz Da'ata, to offer her some comfort, to soothe her. Now, separating from the exchange we just looked at, where the moon would not be appeased by all the offers God had to make, I take Rashi's words a little differently, which are, yeah, we're not the fullness of the great light. We are the little light that waxes and wanes, that contracts, that even goes to a point of disappearing at times. And yet, the stars means that we're surrounded by millions of other little lights. The stars are all the other little lights that are around us. That we are not, each one of us is not alone in that experience of contraction, of diminishment, of loss of self, of loss of light, of loss of a sense of place. But actually we're surrounded by many others with their own version, but of a similar experience. So I'm just going to take a moment and look at the chat here. Okay, and I'll let you all know that there will be a source sheet included with when I'll mail out the recording of this with a source sheet, so you can look at the texts more on your own. So first of all, I want to thank you for bearing with me as we waded through a lot of words and a lot of text. And maybe at this moment, take a few minutes, just any particular reflections, anything that struck you particularly, that disturbed you particularly, touched you from what we shared here. You can write it in the chat, or if a couple people want to briefly share. And I'm asking briefly because we're also going to give space for about 10 minutes of practice together before we close today. But just inviting here any brief sharings, noticings. It's not right or wrong here. This is really asking from a place of subjective receiving and experience. We're not alone. We're all stars. Contemplating the idea that pain contains us, it gives us the vessel to hold the light. So the darkness will always be with us. No need to struggle to defeat it. Relating us to the moon and stars really resonates and touched my spirit. Feels like Chazal want to communicate the interwoven quality of loss and generativity that we can experience both at once wherever we find ourselves in the present moment. Okay, yeah, so beautiful. Thank you for sharing these. The space of divine absence is the same place of human invitation and presence. I just wanted to say actually one thing on some of, a lot of these sources we're looking at, especially at the end of, light and dark. And I want to actually add a layer here that the word choshech in Hebrew, which translates as darkness, choshech shares a spelling and the same letters as chasach, which actually means like a withholding or a prevention. In a sense, choshech, darkness, is a withholding of light. It is not necessarily a dichotomous force of its own. And even more so, I want to translate choshech here as in a sense, an absencing. It's an absencing. It's not true emptiness. Similar to what Benny wrote here about the Bayir text. There's bohu, there's something there. We experience it as absence. But within that absencing is in a sense a kind of obscuration of divine presence, a kind of, the divine presence is so thick and impenetrable there that the experience of it is absent. And yet what these sources are just kind of tweaking here is a possibility to relate to bohu, something absenced here, but perhaps not absent or gone. I can relate it to a sense of, in my mind, I go to a sense of dissociation, right? Dissociation is something that we experience at times on the subjective plane where we're gone, we are elsewhere, and yet we are here, and yet we are not, right? As a response to, a very natural and instinctive response to pain, to trauma, there's an absencing. There's a going elsewhere, but not actually leaving. And because it is an absencing rather than a truly being erased, that's where we have a possibility for working with the impulse toward absencing to find a way back to presence. Someone's raising a hand. Yes. Is it pronounced Delia?
Delia.
Okay, yeah,
This
please.
has been, I am so thrilled to have been connected to your teaching because it supports me for the feeling with no textual support for, we're not here for including Hakol and Ra, which I've always known about. That's why we're here. It's not wrong that it's when God looks at the world, God sees God. And that supports us maintaining faith in this situation. Thank you so
Yeah,
much.
I'm touched to hear that your experience that you know to be true for yourself is supported by the texts, and that it allows for a kind of bridging in a language. I would like, just with a sensitivity to our timing, I'd like to take time now to transition into a brief practice, and then be about 10 minutes, and we'll close there. So first, I just want to say before we transition in there, many of you are here for the free trial of this session. If you do want to follow up and are interested in the rest of the course, so you can register through the AJS website. I'll be sending out an email with info. Okay, don't want to spend too much time on that, but just wanted to say that. And so here for practice, you can all choose what's most comfortable, if that's to leave your camera on, if it's to leave your camera off. We'll keep our mics on mute for now. And anything that I'm saying here is merely by way of suggestion and invitation. And my deeper invitation is for you to go with what works for you and what feels right for you. And actually just aware that we're also approaching the winter solstice very soon, the time of diminished light in the most pronounced way of the year. So I want to just take some time to give space for us to feel into some of these things that we touched on in this exploration today, and specifically the diminishment of the moon, the sense of smallness, of contraction, and allowing for there to be presence of absence, presence of choshech. So maybe to begin, just to invite you to, let your eyes wander off the screen and just your senses to take in your present surroundings. Just relocating yourself in the here and now where you are. And if it feels right, to invite you to let your eyes gently close and bringing your attention inward. Letting awareness gently settle into the body. You may sense your feet touching the ground, your hands making contact with whatever they are contacting. And the weight of your body supported by the chair or couch or bed or ground that you're sitting on. Allowing the breath to invite attention to the inner sensations of the body. Not looking for anything in particular, but welcoming and noticing kind of encounter with what's here, with what's being felt as it is in the here and now. Finding the rhythm of the breath, sensing how it supports you being here, living in this body with this experience, moment to moment. And if it feels okay for you to welcome in some experience you have or you can identify with choshech, with a feeling of something that causes a kind of response within you toward contraction, whether that's as I am here sitting in Israel where it is nighttime, sensing the darkness of night, whether it's sensing something that causes a feeling of, oh, I don't know how to identify a sense of connection or godliness here. Whether it is your own experience, whether it's one of someone dear to you, whether it's one of someone far away, but that you can sense that kind of feeling toward. And just advising you here not to choose necessarily something so big and painful, something close enough that you can sense your own body's response to welcoming in some area of life, some experience where the divine is not readily apparent, far from it. Something that challenges the sense of order and wholeness, that touches on tohu, on that presence of something of chaos, something we don't know how to feel God through. And just noticing what happens in your body as you acknowledge and become aware of that. And simply noticing what happens on the level of sensation. If there's a contraction, to actually just welcome the contraction. If there's a closing, to welcome the closing. Allowing it to really move in its natural way. As God said to the moon, L'chi u'me'ati et atzmech. Go and make yourself small. This natural inclination toward retreating inward or contracting or closing or whatever else your response is, simply welcoming it. Noticing what happens inside as you make space for yourself to experience this encounter with darkness, with obscuration, with confoundedness, the tohu. And welcoming in the possibility, just the presence of whatever it is here that I'm encountering. I don't need it to be resolved right now. I don't need it to be vanquished right now. Yotzer or uvoreh choshech. Divine forms light, creates darkness. Oseh shalom, makes peace. Uvoreh et hakol, creates all. I don't know how this can exist in God's world, and yet it does. I don't know how I can exist alongside this, and yet here I do. Bringing breath to my body. Noticing if there is access to some sense of anchor amidst these challenging energies. Inviting in the support of the Ma'or HaKatan, the small light, the little moon, that is even here when she shows no light at all. And yet, she's there too. Inviting in, as Martin Prechtel offered us, the birthright of each one of us, of singing a song of grief as a praise for life. Not that we need to sing, but to know that our experience of grief, of loss, of confoundedness, it belongs as we belong here. And finally, allowing ourselves to take in the dozens of other individuals and people that are here in this room with us in this moment, sharing this experience, Ve'et HaKochavim, as the stars that fill the night sky. Each one bearing the experiences of being human in our own unique, beautiful way. Each one its own little light. And feeling ourselves as part of this collective, both in this room and well beyond it. The collective of the stars. And that for now, can it be okay to be a little light, supported by multitudes of little lights. To end our exploration for today, I'll share a brief story inspired by teachings of Reb Asher Freund. That there was once a man who had a heart of stone. And he went and looked throughout the world for ways to get rid of his heart of stone. And he asked for all kinds of advice and guidance of how to rid himself of the heart of stone, and none of them worked. And he would cry out to the heavens, why am I fated to have this heart of stone? Till finally he went to a wise sage. And he asked, how can I get rid of this heart of stone? And the sage told him, don't get rid of it. Carry it. And as we move together through this first stage of our journey here, inviting us to allow ourselves compassionately to carry whatever pain that we carry, whatever grief that we carry, whatever contraction we carry. There's space for all the phases of the moon. And here in this exploration, we're welcoming the moon to be our teacher. Welcoming the little lights to be our teachers. So thank you all. It's an honor to share this with you. And I'll be following up with an email. You're welcome to unmute yourselves. Any parting words, any parting reflections, or just a goodbye?
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ravami. Legitraot. I hope not goodbye.
Beautiful teaching. Thank you.
Thank you all. And
Did you say there was going to be a source sheet that we're going to get?
yeah, I'll follow up with an email with a slideshow and a source sheet information for what's next. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you
Very-
so much. Thank you. It was wonderful.
Thank you. So inspirational. It felt like being rebirthed.
Thank you for being first. Take care, everybody.
Mm.
Bye.